This is Russia. Let's just say this country has been a bit controversial recently, but I'm going to tell you it's been controversial long before that, and I want to explain its history here. My name is Anish, and in this YouTube video, I'm going to explain Russian and Soviet history in the 20th century, from the Russian Revolution to the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's get into it. Alright, so the year is 1900, and pretty much all countries in Europe are dabbling with democracy or constitutional monarchies. Not Russia. The political system of Russia at the time was something called autocracy. It means that all power is concentrated into the hands of one lucky person. In the Russian case, that lucky person was none other than Tsar Nicholas II, a stubborn man who was in charge of one of the largest empires in history and accountable to absolutely nobody. A recipe for disaster. Quickly, here's an origin story for Nicholas. So he was born in 1868 under the reign of his grandfather Alexander II, who was known in Russia as the Great Reformer. Back in his day, Russia had a system called serfdom, which was pretty similar to slavery, except these Russian serfs made up the majority of the population. A serf was basically someone who was attached to a piece of land, and life for them was pretty grim. They were basically owned by their landlords, they weren't allowed to travel, and if they're lucky, their life expectancy was like 30. The presence of this very backwards feudal system was preventing Russia from getting workers into the cities and modernising the country. So in 1861, Alexander II decided that he was going to change all of that and emancipated the Russian serfs. That isn't to say life for the Russian peasants got much better. Most were still forced to pay huge redemption payments for their freedom, and 40 years later, still hardly any peasants actually owned their own land, which was a big issue. Anyway, the political system under Alexander II was still very autocratic, but again, he was thinking of changing that. But on the day that Alexander was going to make constitutional reforms and create a parliament, a bomb explosion went off in St. Petersburg, and he was badly wounded. Nicholas and his father, Alexander III, watched the Tsar on his deathbed, and they came to the conclusion that this is what happens when you give the people what they want. Alexander III was known as a tough guy, and his reign was marked by a complete crackdown on radical groups and a shift away from his father's more liberal reforms. He died quite young in 1894, and a 26-year-old Nicholas II came to the throne. Russia at this time was a massive empire, but they definitely had threats to deal with. In the east, you have the Japanese who are modernizing and building up their army very quickly. The Russians and the Japanese are both competing for influence of this area of China called Manchuria, because in those days, like, everyone messed with China. And then in the west, you have the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, who are getting a little too friendly with each other, and this was starting to scare Russia. These powers had modern, well-equipped armies, and industrialization in Russia was seen as the key to keeping up with them. Nicholas's right-hand man, Sergei Witte, encouraged huge amounts of foreign capital and expertise into Russia, and slowly but surely, Russia was getting there. But at the same time, industrialization meant that millions and millions of workers were coming into the city, and this new working class became the perfect breeding ground for some radical ideas to spread. Marxism. Okay, so we've clarified that Russia has some internal problems, and instead of addressing them, Nicholas decides to go to war with Japan. To be fair, in the early days of the Russo-Japanese War, it did bring the empire together to fight the common enemy, but this sentiment really died out as the war progressed and Russia started losing. Humiliating defeats at the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima proved that both Russia's army and navy was inferior to the Japanese. Bear in mind that at the time, no Asian country had managed to defeat a big European power in modern warfare, so this was a huge blow to national prestige. Russia definitely believed that they would achieve a short and decisive victory, but this was not the reality, and a nation that prided itself on its military was completely humiliated by a smaller, supposedly inferior nation. Back at home, anti-war sentiment was growing, and the country became extremely divided. Everything kicked off on the 9th of January 1905, when over 100,000 people, led by a Russian priest, started protesting outside the Winter Palace against the poor working and living conditions in the city. These protesters were peaceful, and some even held portraits of their beloved Tsar. But Nicholas's own personal troops, the Cossacks, were ordered to put down the protests and fired upon the crowds, killing hundreds of innocent civilians. What started as a protest eventually ended up as a massacre, and the event became known as Bloody Sunday. And although Nicholas wasn't even in the palace on that day, it was not a good look for him. The image of the Tsar as the protector of the people was completely destroyed. Across the empire, strikes and protests were widespread, and this marks the beginning of the 1905 revolution. For the next few months, peasant uprisings, worker strikes, soldier mutinies, and a whole load of violence. You get the picture. By October, over 2 million workers were on strike, and the railways and major cities of the empire completely came to a standstill. To end the chaos, the Tsar had to promise political concessions. Nicholas created an elected parliament called the Duma, and at this point it seemed as if the Tsar was willing to give up his autocratic powers. Right? Wrong. In 1906 he issued the Fundamental Laws, and Nicholas made it pretty clear that he was still the MVP and that he wasn't going anywhere. The Duma could be dissolved whenever Nicholas wanted, and he had a veto over any laws that the Duma wanted to pass. The system didn't really change, and even the nobility started to turn on Nicholas. But either way, the regime still survives the 1905 revolution, and it will then have to face its next big test. So the First World War breaks out after an Austro-Hungarian prince was shot up by Serbian nationalists. Russia entered the war in defense of their fellow Slavic country Serbia, and the network of alliances in Europe pretty much drags everyone into it. And here's a crazy fact. The English king, the German Kaiser, and the Russian Tsar were all first cousins. It was one dysfunctional family, and before starting a massive global, all-encompassing war, they probably could have gone on Dr. Phil. So the war starts, and the Russian army is the largest army in the world at the time, estimated to have around 6 million men. But the German army proves to be better trained and far better equipped, and one of the most powerful war machines the world had ever seen. Austria-Hungary not so much. The Eastern Front of the First World War was absolutely brutal and nearly twice the size of the Western Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The German blueprint for victory was to take out the French quickly, then focus on Russia. So Russia tried to go on the offensive, which did not go well. Poorly equipped armies, bad communications, and underdeveloped railways didn't do much to help, and the war was not going well for the Russians. To make matters worse, Nicholas decided that there was only one man who could save the country: himself. So he decided to make himself commander-in-chief of the army in 1915. Very, very stupid, because if anything goes wrong in the war, then he's the one to blame. But that's not all. Well, back home in St. Petersburg, a holy mystic called Rasputin was living in the royal palace. So Nicholas and his wife were cousins, and their son Alexei suffered from a condition called haemophilia. It means that if you get a paper cut, it's not looking good, bruv. Rasputin supposedly could heal Alexei's condition, and so they kept him around as some sort of mystical paramedic. But the public didn't actually know about Alexei's condition, and from their perspective, they're really confused why this man is living with the royal family. When Nicholas left for the front in 1915, he left his German wife Alexandra in charge, and people thought that she and Rasputin were secretly pulling the strings and destroying the country from the inside. Again, not the best look for Nicholas. Anyway, the war was not going well, and it was taking a big toll on the Russian people. All resources were going to the front, and that meant food shortages, awful working conditions, and the government printing a lot of money to fund the war, resulting in massive inflation. The standard of living for the Russian people dropped dramatically, and on the front lines, thousands of soldiers were deserting. So you have people annoyed at the war, people annoyed at the food shortages, and people annoyed at the royal family. Put them together, and what do you get? A Russian Revolution. In 1917, the regime had met its breaking point. On the 22nd of February, women in Petrograd went on strike against the food rationing and poor living conditions in the city. Then the workers started protesting, and soon around 250,000 people filled the city, calling for an end to the war and an end to the Tsar. Things got even worse. As the troops were ordered to fire in the crowds, they refused and actually joined the protesters. With the army on their sides, the situation became completely uncontrollable, and Nicholas had lost control of the capital. Nicholas's ministers and army chiefs advised him to abdicate, and he actually listened to them, although he did try and pass the throne to his brother just before. Classic Nicholas. Anyway, on the 2nd of March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated, and just like that, 400 years of Romanov rule and autocracy in Russia came to an end. The new government put in place was called the Provisional Government, and was made up of ministers from the final Duma. Immediately, this new government announced freedom of opinions, faith, assembly, amnesty for all political prisoners, and promised free and fair elections in Russia. From autocracy, Russia suddenly became the freest society in Europe. But there was another group called the Petrograd Soviet, which was founded by a guy called Leon Trotsky, and it was designed to represent the soldiers and the workers in Russia. The Provisional Government was the internationally recognized body and the official government of Russia, although the Soviets probably had more power here. The main point in which they differed was in regards to the war. The Provisional Government wanted to keep on fighting, whilst the Soviets wanted to find a peace settlement without losing any territory. The Minister of War in the Provisional Government was a creepy-looking guy called Kerensky. In June, he launched a massive offensive against Austria-Hungary. That fails badly, and this destabilizes the government, and the whole command structure of the army collapsed. Russia was in an awful state, and in the countryside, a peasant revolution was taking place, as peasants just started stealing land from people. Things got even worse as Ukraine and Finland created their own national parliaments and demanded independence from Russia. So the empire seemed to be falling apart, but a group called the Bolsheviks seemed to have an answer to their problems. So going back a few months, when the news of the revolution was announced, Germany sent an angry little guy called Vladimir Lenin to cook up some trouble in Russia, and he did a pretty good job. He led a group called the Bolsheviks, and their slogan, peace, bread and land, seemed to correspond to exactly what the Russian people wanted: to end the war, stop the food shortages, and fix the land problems. The Bolsheviks' popularity soared in 1917, and by September, they were the major party in the Petrograd Soviet. But the thing about the Bolsheviks was, rather than more moderate Marxists in Russia, they believed that the way to take power was through an armed revolution. That armed revolution was made so much easier when in September, Kerensky gave the Bolsheviks a bunch of weapons to defend Petrograd, fearing that a rogue general called Kornilov was planning to launch a coup against the provisional government. Big mistake. Anyway, by October 1917, the Germans were getting dangerously close to Petrograd, and it seemed like the state was going to collapse. So the Bolsheviks got together and decided that it was time for a little military coup. Without firing a shot, the Bolsheviks took control of the telephone and telegraph lines in the capital, and in the following days, the Red Guards had arrested the provisional government. They took control of the Winter Palace, and that was it. The Bolsheviks had taken power in Russia with relatively low violence. Well, for now. Next up in the Russia series is the Russian Civil War. So immediately in November, the Bolsheviks want to hold elections to legitimize their regime. So the first free elections in the country's history is held in the Constituent Assembly, and the Bolsheviks lose. So, of course, Lenin dissolves the Constituent Assembly, outlaws all other political parties, and eventually makes Russia a one-party, one-ideology state. Now that's what I call democracy. And let's not forget that Russia is still in a massive war in Europe, so Lenin announces the decree on peace, which promised Russia's withdrawal from the First World War. Trotsky was in charge of peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk, and after over 3 years of fighting and over 6 million German and Austro-Hungarian casualties on the Eastern Front, you already know that they're not going to let the Russians off lightly. The Central Powers demanded that the Russian Empire allows national self-determination in its borderlands, and that meant giving up Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. But Trotsky had a brilliant plan. He genuinely believed that a communist revolution in Germany was imminent, which would end the war altogether. So he delayed negotiations and stalled for time. Turns out he was wrong, and after a few months of stalling, the Germans just got fed up and started to march on Petrograd. Lenin intervened and said that they have to sign now, no matter what the cost. So now Germany offered the Bolsheviks much harsher terms. Russia was to pay indemnities, disarm their army, and lose a massive chunk of territory. Honestly, I think there's a case to be made that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was actually much harsher than the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany after the First World War. With the stroke of a pen, there was peace on the Eastern Front, but Russia had lost a third of its population and 2/3 of heavy industry. And to rub salt in the wound, Russia was about to enter one of the most brutal civil wars in history. So the Russian Civil War starts, and it's pretty much everyone versus the Bolsheviks. The Red Army was the Bolshevik militant force, whilst the White Army was your anti-communist opposition. And then there's a Green Army who just hate everybody, but it's mainly between the Reds and the Whites. The Red Army were definitely the underdogs, and at the start of the war, they were only controlled about 1/5 of Russia's land, and they definitely did not have the majority of popular support. But a couple of things went their way. For one, the leadership of Leon Trotsky was incredibly important. Whilst Lenin handled politics and ideology, Trotsky was in charge of the army. He basically had to build an entire Red Army out of the shambles of the old Russian army. And during the war, Trotsky would travel to the front lines, giving motivational speeches and inspiring his troops. Then you have the White Army, who were made up of a lot of different groups, such as monarchists, liberals, more moderate socialists, and even some non-Russians who just wanted independence. All of these groups had different motives, but what they could agree on was that the Bolsheviks had to go. Britain, the USA, France and Japan also stepped in to support the Whites because these countries hated the idea of Bolshevism and didn't want it anywhere near their countries. But a little side note in the story, the ex-Tsar Nicholas II and his family were still alive, and the Bolsheviks kept them in a safe house in the city of Yekaterinburg. But on the 17th of July 1918, as the White Army approached the city to liberate Nicholas, he and his family were sent to the basement of their house and were executed. So a couple of months later, and the Central Powers collapsed, and the Bolsheviks now had an opportunity to win back the territory they had lost after signing Brest-Litovsk. They took back Ukraine and the South Caucasus, but unfortunately for Russia, they still lost Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. The civil war went on for a few more years, and it was clear that the Reds had some massive advantages. For one, they controlled the railways and industry in Russia, and this was incredibly important. This meant that they could transport anything to the front lines. From army munitions to iPods, they had you covered. Reason number two is that they were also a lot more effective at conscripting soldiers. Turns out people don't like to be forced to fight in wars, and so the Whites had a massive problem with desertion. As the Red Army made serious gains, the foreign powers started to realize that the war was a lost cause, and support for the Whites started to collapse, and the Bolsheviks simply came out on top. Then in 1922, the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republics combined to make a giant Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, aka the Soviet Union, aka the Motherland. Coming out of the Civil War, the situation was really, really bad. Over 10 million people had been killed, over 3 million people had fled the country, and the economy was producing far below its output in 1913. Lenin tried the whole socialism thing by nationalising industry, banking, transport and foreign trade, but the economy was still massively underperforming. They had to offer economic relaxations through the new economic policy, which allowed private trade and small-scale private enterprise. It was a shift back towards capitalism, something that Marxists weren't a huge fan of, but it did get Russian industry back on track, just in time for a little psycho to take power, who would turn the Soviet Union into the first fully socialist state in history. So Lenin suffers from a series of strokes and dies in 1924, and there was a massive question about who was going to replace him. It was between Trotsky and a guy called Joseph Stalin, and if you thought Lenin was controversial, wait till you meet Joseph. So Stalin weaved his way to the top, of course doing some very shady things in the process, and Trotsky is forced to leave the country, and he eventually ends up in Mexico. With Stalin at the wheel, he abandons the new economic policy and makes a full shift towards what he called socialism in one country. Centralized economic planning was introduced through 5-year plans, and Stalin's achievements were impressive. Between 1929 and 1940, Soviet industrial production tripled, and the USSR became the second largest economy in the world. Even more significant, this centralized Soviet model seemed to be immune to the destructive effects of worldwide depression in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was becoming a modern industrial economy, and this was also marked by a massive boom in literacy. Then in the rural parts of the Soviet Union, where the majority of the people still lived, you have a process called collectivization. In this system, peasants were forced to give up their individual farms and join together with other peasant households to form one giant, big communal farm. In these collectives, peasants would live and work together, and they were given production quotas by the state. By 1940, almost all peasant households were collectivized, but this process was a very messy one. A lot of peasants would rather destroy their own equipment or kill their livestock than hand them over to the collective. Collectivization was also used for a little game of class warfare. The wealthier peasants called kulaks were seen as bourgeois and were targeted by the state, and around 5 to 7 million people were identified as such. That meant they're either going to get arrested, executed, or sent to slave labour camps called gulags. But by liquidating the most productive peasants in the country and forcing grain requisitioning, this caused a major famine in the early 1930s and hit Ukraine and the South Caucasus very hard. Somewhere between 5 to 10 million people died during the Great Famine, and there's a big question about whether Stalin did it on purpose to eliminate the Ukrainian independence movement. So we've established that Stalin wasn't exactly a good guy, but in the late 1930s he's making this very clear. He slaughtered millions of his own people, and no section of society was safe from him. The notorious secret police, the NKVD, really ramped up their activities, and by 1939, nearly 3 million people were in the Gulag system. People could literally snitch on their neighbours to get them taken away, which doesn't actually sound too bad. Anyway, to get rid of his critics, Stalin held public show trials in which the old Bolshevik leaders were accused of phony charges and made to confess after a lot of torture. This removed all his political rivals. So essentially, society was completely controlled by the government, and the government was completely controlled by Stalin. You may have seen these photos of some guy literally getting erased from history. I wouldn't feel too bad for him though. Yezhov was a real piece of work. Stalin also attacked religion and even his own army, purging tens of thousands of Red Army officers. This perceived weakness of the Red Army was one of the main reasons why Nazi Germany believed that they could attack and defeat the USSR. Speaking of which, about 10 years earlier, a failed artist called Adolf was making his controversial opinions very clear in his book, Mein Kampf. In this book, he basically said that the communists are the scum of the earth and the Slavic people belong to an inferior race. Hitler eventually becomes the leader of Germany, and the country was just getting a little bit bigger in the late 1930s. Logically, the next place Hitler would expand is eastwards into Poland, and if that happened, it would be an immediate red flag for the Soviets. This led to a deal that shocked the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union would carve up Poland and increase trade with each other. This was extremely surprising to the Western countries because these two powers were ideological enemies, and they made no secret of that, but never put anything past a ruthless dictator. So a deal between Stalin and Hitler is made that even Satan would be proud of. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, sparking the Second World War, and 2 weeks later, Stalin invades Poland from the east. Stalin essentially saw the war as an opportunity to win back the territories of the old Russian Empire, so he attacked Finland in November, but the Winter War did not go well for the Soviets. They did eventually win, but it came at a huge cost, and the Red Army suffered 6 times more losses than the Finns. So the Winter War revealed to Stalin that the Red Army was not cut out for a proper war, and led to a lot of military reforms. And guess what? Even more army purges. Stalin then goes on to annex the Baltic states. Yeah, in the first few years of the war, alongside the Nazis, the Soviets were definitely the bad guys. They even got kicked out of the League of Nations. Not like that matters anymore. You know, if you ever feel useless in life, just think about the League of Nations in World War II. So a couple of years into the war in 1941, and the Axis powers pretty much controlled most of Europe. Germany then starts to build up troops on its frontier with the Soviet Union. Now this is the part of history I can't seem to get my head around. There are so many warnings to Stalin that Hitler was going to invade, but he just dismisses them all as disinformation. The Nazis were stationing millions of troops on his frontiers, German recon aircrafts were flying over Soviet cities, and then some Soviet spies and even Churchill and Roosevelt warned Stalin about an imminent invasion. This didn't change anything, and Stalin was completely taken by surprise when on the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, and over 3 million German troops, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircrafts poured into the Soviet Union in the largest and bloodiest invasion in history. The Germans used their blitzkrieg warfare to make rapid progress into the Soviet Union. After 6 months, around 2/5 of the country's population and half of its resources were held by the Germans, as well as 3 million prisoners of war. The Nazis had taken Kiev, they had reached Moscow and put Leningrad under a siege which lasted nearly 900 days. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was absolutely brutal, and news of the atrocities and horrors that the advancing Wehrmacht were committing were broadcasted to the nation. Hitler kind of gambled that a really destructive and horrific war would force the Soviets to sue for peace, but Stalin was adamant that surrender was never an option. A couple of months later, Pearl Harbor happens and the USA finally joins the war. So the dream team comes together, and Britain, the USA and the Soviet Union would work together to wipe out Hitler. The Soviets did secure a whole lot of resources from their allies, but Stalin didn't really trust the West, and he believed that they were deliberately letting the Soviets take all of the bloodshed in this war. Things were not looking good for the Soviet Union, but the people were very resilient. Millions of men and women joined the army, and during World War II, the Red Army had mobilized up to 34 million people to defend the motherland. The Soviets used scorched earth tactics to slow down the Germans, and all women and teenagers in Moscow helped to build anti-tank fortifications to defend the city. Stalin even ordered his army to fight to the last drop of blood, and he said that he would rather Soviet soldiers be executed than being taken as a prisoner of war. Just to reiterate, he wasn't the nicest person. It was all or nothing, with the state's rallying slogan, everything for the front, everything for victory. The people of the Soviet Union were able to hang on, and then it got cold, like really cold. The Russian winter of 1941 was extremely tough on the Germans. They didn't pack right, and their machinery started to freeze, and they didn't have the winter clothing to survive the Russian winter. Under the leadership of General Zhukov, the Red Army was able to defend the capital, and then fresh Soviet troops came in from the east and started to push the Germans away from Moscow. After their failure at Moscow, in 1942, the Nazis tried to focus on the south, trying to take oil fields in Baku, and also the city of Stalingrad, maybe something to do with the name. As far as I know, the Battle of Stalingrad is the bloodiest battle in history with over 2 million casualties. But maybe it's even the most important. Soviet victory at Stalingrad was a massive turning point in the war. From then on, the Nazis were on the back foot and the Soviets would advance and advance towards Berlin, liberating, or some would say occupying, the countries of Eastern Europe in the process. When Allied troops finally landed in Normandy in June of 1944, the Soviets launched their major military offensive, Operation Bagration, and by May 1945, the Red Army had captured Berlin and the Third Reich surrendered. In the aftermath of World War II, the scale of devastation to the Soviet Union was unparalleled. 70,000 villages and 1,700 towns were destroyed, and the death toll, get ready for this, 27 million people. 1 in every 8 Soviet citizens died, and it's no surprise that most of these post-Soviet states don't call World War II World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War. World War II has just ended, which was pretty horrific for the Soviet Union. A lot of major cities were torn to shreds, and an estimated 27 million people had been killed. Stalin now had the colossal task of rebuilding the country. But I don't think anyone really expected how rapid the Soviet recovery would be. The Soviet people really came together to rebuild the nation, and by 1950, industry not only recovered, but actually surpassed pre-war levels. This was also helped by some of the most brutal and repressive years in Stalin's rule, and that's saying something. But just as one war ended, there's a whole new conflict starting. As now twice in the last 30 years, the Soviet Union was devastated on its western border, Europe was now considered a massive security risk. Stalin wanted to install friendly regimes in these countries that would act as a buffer zone against the West. And by friendly, I mean very communist. So at the end of World War II, as the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe, they also installed these compliant, friendly governments who just loved communism. Although communism was on the rise, the Soviets definitely did a lot of shady stuff to make sure that by 1948, all of Eastern Europe would fall to communism, and the Soviet Union would now possess an informal empire which stretched across half of Europe. The USA was like, this is just not okay, and announced the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan with the idea of containing the threat of communism. This divide between East and Western Europe was coined as the Iron Curtain by Winston Churchill, and the same guy who called the whole Hitler being a psycho thing was saying that Stalin was just as bad. And so a new era called the Cold War begins, with the USA championing global capitalism and the Soviets championing global communism. A few years on, and Stalin dies in 1953, and believe it or not, that man was nominated for 2 Nobel Peace Prizes in his lifetime. The man who replaced him was Nikita Khrushchev, who had been with the Communist Party since the Civil War and worked his way up the hierarchy. He came from a peasant background, so he was kind of a man of the people, and he had a very weird obsession with corn. Domestically, Khrushchev did pretty well. He built a whole load of houses, and the Soviet Union was the first country to launch an artificial satellite into space with Sputnik in 1957. But there was a big question to be asked about whether he was going to be anything like Stalin. This question was put to bed in 1956 when he gave a speech to the Communist Party officials denouncing the rule of Stalin, and in his so-called secret speech, he said that Stalin grossly abused his powers and that he was responsible for the brutality and the terror of the 1930s. A lot of ordinary Soviet people didn't actually know Stalin was responsible for these atrocities, and this massive truth bomb shocked both the nation and the world. In the aftermath of the speech, censorship and repression was definitely relaxed, and millions of people were rehabilitated from the Gulag system. The secret police was reorganized into the KGB, which was a slightly less repressive organization, but like anything was less repressive than the NKVD. Things were looking upwards, but don't get me wrong, Khrushchev was still not a great person, and he was no stranger to using violence where he really needed to. Khrushchev's downfall actually came in his foreign policy, in which he was very unpredictable. In one incident at the UN General Assembly, he got the Philippine delegate to shut up by banging his shoe on the table. In another incident in the Polish embassy in Moscow, he told Western diplomats, "We will bury you." But anyway, by denouncing Stalin, this had some very serious repercussions in the Eastern Bloc. Encouraged by greater freedom in the USSR and a call to end repression, Poland starts asking for reforms, and then a revolution breaks out in Hungary. The Hungarians wanted to see an end to their Stalinist government, establish a multi-party political system, and withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, which is kind of like Eastern Europe's version of NATO. This deviated from the one-party, one-ideology Soviet model, and was an obvious screw you to the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev sent in the tanks and over 60,000 soldiers and brutally crushed the Hungarian Revolution, killing tens of thousands of civilians, and was met with widespread international outrage. He got away with it though because, at the same time, Britain and France were doing some pretty stupid things in Egypt. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin also helped to break down relations with China. The Chinese leader Mao Zedong respected Stalin as a communist leader and what he had done for collectivization and industrialization in the Soviet Union, and saw Khrushchev's attack on Stalin as an attack on Marxism. Also, Mao was kind of worried that when he died, the same thing was going to happen to him in China. So he went on a whole cultural revolution, but that's a whole nother story. So China and the Soviet Union start beefing, and as they drifted apart, Khrushchev had lost one of his biggest allies. Then you have the German capital Berlin, which was a city deep inside the Soviet-backed East Germany, but had western and eastern zones of occupation. The Soviets were not happy that there were Western troops and American nuclear weapons in West Berlin, and also the fact that so many East Germans were defecting to the West. So Khrushchev took matters into his own hands and issued an ultimatum to Kennedy, demanding the withdrawal of all armed forces from Berlin, which Kennedy refused, and then Khrushchev went full on Trump and said, "I'm going to build a wall," and built a barrier between East and West Berlin to literally prevent his people from leaving East Germany. Not the best advert for communism. The last and final straw for Khrushchev came in Cuba. So the USA had ticked off the Cuban leader Fidel Castro and led him straight into the arms of the Soviets, who would absolutely love to have a friendly communist ally right on America's doorstep. So in 1962, Khrushchev had planned to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, and when America found out, there was a whole naval blockade standoff, which very nearly resulted in nuclear war, if it wasn't for the X-Men. The two sides eventually came to an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the USA would secretly remove theirs from Turkey and promise not to invade Cuba. Kennedy was treated as a hero, and Khrushchev, well, not so much. Some thought it made him look weak, and Castro actually told Khrushchev that he had no cojones. With his foreign policy failures, Khrushchev was kicked from power in 1964 and spent the last few years of his life in his dacha in the countryside. To pick up where I left off, Khrushchev gets kicked from power in 1964, and the man who replaced him was Leonid Brezhnev. He was one of the major generals during the Second World War, and he worked his way into Soviet politics. Let's just say he wasn't as fun as Khrushchev, and the people who made up his government were all dinosaurs of the Communist Party and were very conservative. He was pragmatic in his policies, and there was very minimal change to the political and economic system in the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev era is of course famously known for its economic stagnation. The Soviet economy did pretty well in the early 1970s from a global oil crisis, which hiked up the price of their biggest export. But after that all settled down, the economy was really bad. Consumer spending was low, no one was productive, and so much money was getting pumped into the military, which didn't actually produce any benefit to consumers. To make matters worse, politics in the Soviet Union was full of corruption. The political elites, known as the nomenklatura, and their families, well, they had special privileges in society that really pissed off ordinary people. Did someone say Animal Farm? But let's take a look at foreign affairs. Just like Hungary a decade before, a revolution breaks out in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in what was known as the Prague Spring. This was a movement calling for the liberalization of the economy and for democracy, with their slogan, "Socialism with a human face." Again, this was a massive screw you to the Soviet model, and same old story, the USSR sends in the tanks and brutally crushes the revolution. This forms the foundation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that the Warsaw Pact had a duty to intervene anywhere where socialism was threatened. But on the other side of the world, Brezhnev actually did pretty well with the USA. With China turning against the USSR, Brezhnev decided to patch things up with the USA in a period known as détente. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972 resulted in the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which was a big step in the right direction. But all good things must come to an end, and relations started to break down towards the end of the 1970s. Something that the Soviets weren't too great at was a little thing called respecting human rights. Literally any dissenters to the Soviet regime were treated as enemies of the state, whilst in the West they were treated as heroes standing up to Big Brother. But the tipping point in détente came when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So Afghanistan at this time was very unstable. There was a socialist revolution in 1978, and its new government led by Hasifullah Amin was reforming the country very rapidly, alienating the traditional Islamic thinkers in the country. Internally, Afghanistan was on the brink of a civil war. The Soviets feared that this instability could spread to some of its Muslim-majority republics and encourage separatist movements there. They also suspected that the Afghan government was aligning itself with the West, so in their eyes, Afghanistan was a massive security risk right on their southern border. So the Soviets planned to go in and replace the Afghan government with a pro-Soviet one. But there is a reason why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. And as this conflict dragged on for nearly a decade, it pretty much turned into the Soviet version of the Vietnam War. The USA saw this invasion as direct Soviet expansion into the Middle East, and even Jimmy Carter, who seemed like a pretty chill guy, well, he absolutely lost it, and the Cold War really starts to heat up going into the 1980s. A few years on, and Brezhnev gets old and dies. Then someone takes over and dies. And then someone else takes over and dies. Then we get Mikhail Gorbachev, who is like a breath of fresh air in Soviet politics, because he wasn't going to die. Gorbachev introduced some pretty big reforms into the USSR. One was perestroika, meaning restructuring the Soviet economy. And this planned to reduce centralization and give managers more freedom and autonomy. There was also a big shift away from focusing on heavy industry, and instead focus shifted to consumer goods which could improve the lives of ordinary people. You may not get political rights, but at least you get new iPods. Speaking of political rights, Gorbachev wanted to address this as well. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurs, and this completely reveals the incompetence of communication in the Soviet Union. There was a massive cover-up, and people in the USSR literally got the information about the nuclear disaster from Western news sources, which was a pretty big deal. This was a tipping point for Gorbachev, and he knew that he needed to act now and quickly. He introduced a policy called glasnost, meaning openness, and this meant relaxing censorship and democratizing the Soviet Union. As Gorbachev once said, "We need glasnost like we need fresh air." State censorship of news was relaxed, and eventually new political organizations and non-communists were a thing. And to top it all off, the first McDonald's was opened in the USSR. Imagine being the first Russian to try a McNugget. That's a badge of honor. In foreign policy, there's also massive changes, as Gorbachev told the leaders of Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union will not intervene in their internal development. I don't think anyone actually believed him at first, but by the late 1980s, some pretty awful regimes in Eastern Europe came tumbling down, and Gorbachev stayed true to his words and didn't prop up these failing communist governments. With the West, Gorbachev starts to build dialogue with Ronald Reagan, and he ends the arms race in 1987 with the INF Treaty. He also withdrew troops from Afghanistan in 1988, and in the international image, Gorbachev was a hero. And the Cold War pretty much ended by the late 1980s, maybe into 1990, but the driving factor behind this was Mikhail Gorbachev. But back at home, things weren't so great. Glasnost and perestroika were cooking up some trouble. By democratizing the Soviet Union, the Communist Party were losing their grip on power, and a very powerful anti-communist bloc led by Boris Yeltsin starts to gain influence. Then in the republics, ethnic and nationalist voices were getting louder and louder. But surely the economic reforms were doing okay, right? Wrong. Inflation was high and industrial output was falling, and if you're an econ bro, that's a big no-no. Gorbachev's reforms were undermining the entire system of the Soviet Union, and then all hell broke loose. All the republics, including Russia, demanded independence, and it looked like the Union was falling apart. So who doesn't love a good old-fashioned military coup? So in August of 1991, communist hardliners and the army detained Gorbachev, who was on a lovely relaxing holiday in Crimea. The plotters then sent in thousands of troops into Moscow and declared a new government and put the city on lockdown. In times of crisis, there was only one man who could save the day, and that man was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin took to the streets and got on tanks and rallied thousands of Muscovites against the coup. This very poorly planned seizure of power soon fell apart when the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Ironically, the coup that was meant to keep the Union together actually ended up driving it further apart. Gorbachev got home from his pretty chaotic holiday and he's sidelined in politics, and Yeltsin is now the man in charge. In November, the Communist Party was banned and all the republics began to leave the Union. Kazakhstan was actually the last republic to secede from the Union, so technically for a couple of days, Kazakhstan made up the entire USSR. The Soviet Union was officially abolished on the 31st of December 1991, and thankfully, this is one of the rare cases in history where when an empire falls, there wasn't too much violence. So Russia becomes a country again, with Boris Yeltsin at the wheel. Yeltsin really wanted to implement a market economy, which means capitalism, but he wasn't actually allowed to say that because it was still kind of a dirty word in Russia. Let's just say his market reforms did not go so great, and living standards started falling even more. Unemployment was high, and a lot of crime and alcohol abuse followed. The 90s was a decade of extraordinary change and hardship in Russia, and as you can probably tell from Russia's 20th century, they've had their more than fair share of hardship. Anyway, politics was becoming increasingly turbulent, and there was never really a stable multi-party system. A large communist party still existed, and they wanted to get the band back together and reform the Soviet Union. This time they were going to be called the Soviet Reunion. That's enough dad jokes for today. But Yeltsin stays in power, and he starts to become more and more authoritarian. But how did he actually do this? Well, the Russian state was in some trouble, and some businessmen gave the government massive loans to bail it out. This handful of people, known as the oligarchs, gained considerable influence over Russia's resources, its media, and even its politics. And this is a problem that still exists today. Then in 1999, Vladimir Putin becomes prime minister, and yeah, the creation of the modern Russian state that we know today, and well, maybe not love. That's all for this video and the Russia series, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next country I'm going to cover is Russia's good old friend, the US of A.